Welcome everybody to this special webinar from This Can Happen this afternoon. We're just waiting for people to log in and we will start in a minute. Again, if you're just logging in now, welcome to the This Can Happen webinar today. Everybody's just logging in now, so we'll just wait a minute or so and then we will make a start. I think we are ready to make a start. Thank you very, very much indeed for joining us today to this very special webinar on the supplier and client relationship. My name is Zoe Sinclair and I am co-founder of This Can Happen, and I'm delighted to be joined today by three very special people that have very kindly agreed to be part of this webinar. And who are very aware of This Can Happen. So first of all, one of our partners, Toni Graves, is the Global Head of Reward and Wellbeing at Allen and Overy. Toni, welcome. You can give us a wave. Dhavani Bishop, welcome to you. Dhavani is the Head of Group Colleague Health and Wellbeing at Tesco. Dhavani, thank you so much for joining us. And Bev Taylor, Head of People, Ogilvy Health and Senior People Partner at Ogilvy UK. Bev, welcome. Thank you all so much for joining us, which I think is going to be a really insightful conversation today. So welcome to you, the audience, and please feel free at any time to send in questions anonymously in the Q&A box or in the chat box. I will be monitoring that and coming to you at various points during the session. So we are, in a really great position here to hear from three different people who absolutely engage with suppliers. And this is to look to help the suppliers to know what companies are looking for, and also for companies who are looking to engage with suppliers, how do you go about it? And I think, I will start right at the very beginning, Toni, perhaps with you, just to say, your inboxes must be overflowing. With providers at the moment. We have just seen this huge increase in provision for well-being as a whole, mental health as well. I suppose I'm going to say to you, how do you manage that? And actually, is an email into your inbox likely to gain your attention?
Yeah, thanks, Zoe. I mean, the short answer to that is usually no. Purely because I get so many, and really, anything that looks like direct marketing, if I'm honest, kind of gets deleted because I just need to kind of deal with my day job and make sure I get to the emails that really matter and need to be responded to. So I guess in terms of how I would, more likely to engage with suppliers, it'll often be through recommendations. So it could be other organisations. It could be employees or partners who, have seen something and raise it with us, often through networks. So any kind of networks that you're part of, often suppliers or solution, services will get discussed. The This Can Happen awards are actually a really good way of seeing what other people are doing, what suppliers other people are using. LinkedIn. So I'm more likely to kind of read a piece that someone has written on LinkedIn, and maybe then go and investigate further, or through existing suppliers that you trust, conferences. There's some of the ways that I think I would do it.
Great introduction. Thank you. Really good. And Dhavani, I see you nodding your head a lot there. So do you feel on very similar lines to Toni in that respect?
Yeah, I completely echo what Toni has said in terms of, when you're looking for a partner or a supplier, it is around, looking further than your inbox on recommendations. The other way would be when we do kind of market intelligence reviews and RFPs, that's another way that we would gather information around providers. But for us, it's really looking at what our need is, and if something comes in the inbox that isn't something you need, you're not going to look at it.
So so that's a very good point, actually. Do you always know what you need, or could it be that somebody just talks about something in your network or whatever, and you think, I didn't think about that? Like, do you always know what you need?
I think previously, if you're talking a few years ago, maybe I didn't know what was needed, but I think now we're pretty clear on our strategy, and I think as an organisation, that is something that you should always try and be clear on. What is it that you're going after? What is your wellbeing strategy? Where do you want to be in the next kind of 3 to 5 years? So you're very clear, and you can kind of prioritize, because otherwise it can be a very a saturated market. It can be quite daunting almost. But if you've got a clear vision and a clear view of what you're going after, I think that can be really helpful.
And sorry, you just said something really good, Bev. I'm coming to you right now, but Dhavani, can I just ask, what if you're at the beginning of your journey and you don't necessarily have a very clear vision and a strategy? Tesco is a large company, has a great vision, but what about those that maybe aren't as advanced as you?
Yeah. So I think probably most organisations over the last kind of 3 years probably had to put something in place, or probably did consider something about well-being, especially through the pandemic. So I think if you don't know, review what you've got, review how it's working, get some insight internally in terms of what your colleagues, what your stakeholders are saying about what the need is, and kind of build something, build a kind of almost a business case of what it is that you do need, and then base what you're searching around that. Because it's actually a good place to start when you don't have anything. It's an opportunity to then create and craft what it is that you do need. So it doesn't matter really where you are on the journey, whether you're quite a mature organisation that's got quite a mature kind of wellbeing model, or you're starting out. Start with what you've got, review what you've got in place, because I'm sure a lot of organisations would have put something in. Especially if you've gone and put things in during the pandemic. A lot of people did kind of panic buy and put things in. Review how that's working for you. Is that has that investment really helped your organisation or not? And kind of start from there, I would say.
Great, thank you. And Bev, how did you start on this journey of working with suppliers in the wellbeing space?
I think we're quite advanced as well in terms of what we have in place already. But to Dhavani's point, then actually reviewing what we did in COVID, because it was unprecedented. We didn't know where we were going. We didn't know what the need was. So actually reviewing some of those arrangements now has been crucial for us, and that's actually released some budget that we can now use in other things, such as we've recently put in a coaching provision, so coaching for all, which previously in our market was just for leadership type positions. So there are occasions when there is a need that we've identified, and sometimes we discover a gap just from unsolicited comms. But much as the other ladies have added, it's not something that I don't certainly sit and pore through every communication I receive. If it looks like direct marketing, it does tend to get deleted.
And is your professional network important to you in these circumstances?
Absolutely. And again, to take the point previously, LinkedIn actually is more valuable probably than anything else, in terms of, you know, reading what others are doing, or reading around new offers, new directions. So yeah, that's certainly where we get most of our information.
Interestingly, there's quite a range of suppliers, large, well-known suppliers that have really, you know, cemented their name, others much smaller. Does it bear any influence on your organisation, whether you go for small or large? Does that come into consideration at all?
For us, we're open to both, but I think what we find with smaller suppliers is often they don't meet our requirements from often from a diversity perspective. So if we're looking for if we're looking on wellbeing, we're looking for psychotherapists or counsellors or even coaches. It's important to us that we have a wide range of diverse offers. And what we found in looking at suppliers most recently is that the smaller offers don't have that level of diversity that we need.
Okay, really interesting point. Thank you for that. And Dhavani, coming to you on that, does that influence your?
I wouldn't say it can and it can't really. I think there's obviously some requirements that suppliers need to meet, you know, from a supply assurance perspective, and that is really important. So you know, from a data perspective, from you know, all of those things, and if that can be met, then great. I think sometimes smaller suppliers can be kind of nimble, and you know, they can develop their proposition for what you need as well, where sometimes larger organizations, they're a bit more kind of stuck on their proposition where they won't flex it. So in some aspects, smaller organizations can help. I think the point that Bev made about diversity is really important, especially because kind of for Tesco, it's you know, we could be looking at suppliers or products and services that cover parts of group or the whole of group, depending on what it is. So I think that breadth and coverage is really important as well. But sometimes going for smaller suppliers that can develop or grow their proposition with you is quite a good thing, but it really depends on what it is. But for us, it's also some of those really important process things that need to be met from a supply assurance perspective.
Right, and Toni, coming to you in terms of suppliers and how you start that conversation with them, is there things that you recommend companies to ask suppliers? Is it about your need? Is it even you that gets to have those conversations with the suppliers? Does it get referred up, down? How does that first engagement start with you?
So I think it depends. So to give you a couple of very different examples, so we recently engaged with a new private medical insurer. That was a really big project. We did a full kind of procurement process. So we involved our procurement team. We did a review of the market. We produced a briefing document for the shortlisted organisations. They came in, they did full pitches, etc. So that was a really kind of big piece of work. But you may have a supplier where it's quite a niche. So, you know, for example, we have Peppy Health. When we first joined with Peppy, it was quite early on in their journey. They were still relatively small. So, and also it was quite a niche service. So it wasn't as though there were lots of people that were offering that service. So in that situation, it was much more about, you know, starting with an informal conversation just to get an overview of the product or the service. I think it's always worth asking suppliers if they have existing customers who might be willing to speak to you. Certainly if it involves any kind of clinical support, you need to be asking about the accreditations, and I think we've already had the diversity point. Asking them about personal data, so any personal data that they would need to process or hold. Certainly for us, when we're contracting, that is an area that kind of takes up a lot of time in getting the contracts finalized. If it's a technology-based solution, think about whether you can access it through single sign-on, so it kind of removes a barrier for your people to access it. You want to be asking them about what kind of data or reporting they can provide. Ask them about their take-up and usage stats with existing customers. Locations, so obviously if you're a multinational or you have, you know, more than one location, understanding if they can service that at all. Definitely pricing structure. You want to understand that fairly quickly. Whether or not they can do any tailoring of their service. And then you would kind of get into sort of a, you know, a demo of the products, etc.
Oh, that was a brilliant overview. Bev, coming to you, if you, obviously, as we said, we're not asking you to name any suppliers or anything, but if you think of a supplier that you work really well with, you know, why does that work so well? What do they do for you that you are just very happy with?
I think it comes down to data and reporting, how we're measuring success on that particular product. And I think, you know, having regular contacts with that supplier, making sure that we've got you know, very clear expectations with the supplier, whether that's a quarterly review, or, you know, or how we contact them if we have an issue or a challenge with them, or if our employees have an issue or a challenge. Some of those, it's the relationship for us that's really important.
And touching on what you just said about data, obviously in the world that we live in now, kind of the usage of data and collecting of data has really changed dramatically over the last few years. How you know, how do you expect to receive it? What sort of data are you expecting to receive from your suppliers? And indeed, what do you do with it?
So we often get data just on demand via portals, and then we expect that we get insights and bigger picture data presented to us often on a quarterly basis. And that data that comes in those quarterly insights, we expect them to, you know, that they go a step further. They proactively support us in addressing our business challenges. And, you know, they'd have a really clear overview of what our strategic goals are, and how we expect that product to help meet them. So that tends to be what we expect from a supplier. And then how we use it, we'll then take that back into you know, C-suite meetings. We'll use it to assess whether actually we're getting the return on investment we're expecting. And ultimately then decision making as to whether it's something we continue with, whether we switch supplier, whether it's something that we just don't need at all.
Right, okay. And Dhavani, is there anything that you would like to add to that in terms of data?
I think I'll probably echo what kind of Bev said. We would all, I suppose it's also about kind of getting things on demand, trying to, I think, linking it back to what are we hoping that the data is going to answer in terms of bigger picture, and getting some trends about what it's really telling us about what's going on for colleagues. That's what we would try to understand. And also, is there anything else that we need to do that the product or the service can't fix? It's something that needs to be done organisationally. So we would always try and look at, see what that is telling us, because that's also something that you can then use to influence your stakeholders internally to say, this is how this product and services is helping. However, it's uncovered a really big need here or there, and this is what we need to put in place. So yeah, so it's making sure you're using the insight from that perspective.
And for you specifically, Dhavani, and I think Toni, applies to you as well. Is it important for your whoever you engage to have global presence, or are you quite open to having different providers in different locations?
It really depends on what the service is, but quite open, because for some services it's really difficult to get one supplier or one provider that will do that across the globe. And obviously if it's to do with some clinical practice, sometimes you've got different legislations and things like that you need to kind of manage, and sometimes you do want a local supplier for something because it just helps with wherever you are in that wellbeing journey for that market. So it really does depend, and I think as an organization you have to be a bit open-minded about, you know, the kinds of providers that you could use, and how you can actually service some products and services, because you can do it in multiple ways. But I think one of the things that you do need to think about as an organization is you can get lots of overlap as well with services and products with different suppliers. So it is taking that step back and having a bit more of a supplier strategy about what services are you using from which providers to be a bit more efficient with the services you have, because there is a lot of overlap in the market.
Yes, and would you, yes, I've got too many things going on in my mind, but Toni, would you agree with that in terms of open-minded? You don't have to have one provider that's going to be able to do everything for everyone.
Yeah, I completely agree. So I think you have to take each service independently and think about, you know, whether that would be effective if it was delivered internationally or not. You know, there are cultural differences as well, for example. So you may get better engagement with a local supplier. Equally, you know, for some of our smallest offices, you know, they don't necessarily have the budget or the bandwidth to be able to engage lots of local suppliers, or there may not even be the suppliers there to engage with. So it's really looking at each service independently.
Perfect. And just Bev, to come to you, in fact, probably to ask everybody this question, but how have you ever had circumstances where providers maybe need to work together? Is there a dialogue between providers ever? Transparency between the providers that you use for different things? Does that ever happen?
No, not that I've experienced so far, actually. To take the point on the overlap, that is a real issue for us at the moment, in that we've got, you know, various providers that we've brought on for a specific thing, but actually they overlap slightly with something else, and actually that does cause confusion, I think, in the space, with people not knowing which provider to seek for the right purpose at the right time. So we actually spend quite a lot of our time as a team signposting people, which really shouldn't, it should be more self-service than that. So I think from a supplier perspective, trying to get something which is addressing many issues or many needs would be, you know, that's the ideal scenario, but we're not there yet by no means.
That's a very interesting point. Dhavani, did you want to say something on that?
Yeah. So what we tend to do is, once we've got services that are live, what we try and do is we're very clear on what service we want to point colleagues to in each provider. So what we will also tend to do is to make sure that our providers are clear on what service that each other provides. So if there needs to be any signposting for colleagues, so for example, if, you know, a colleague who's contacted our OH service needs to be signposted to EAP, for example, there's that appropriate signposting that we can do. So suppliers can actually do that for colleagues, because the way that we try and focus on is this is about making the colleague journey as seamless as possible. So they don't need to worry about who in the background is supplying what, that they get the right information when they need it. So we do I try and do some integration with our partners to make sure they know who they all are, and they know who, you know, what their core services, and we are clear on how we want them to signpost colleagues, just for that seamless journey. So that's what we try to do.
That's really useful. Thank you, Dhavani. And Toni, did you want to add something to that?
No, I was going to say, I mean, exactly the same as Dhavani's just said, actually. So yeah, we try and make sure that the suppliers all know, you know, who else we're working with. Often we'll signpost different services within, you know, so within one supplier, we might be signposting services that are provided by someone else. Again, you know, just trying to join things up as much as possible.
Yeah, no, great. So really, I've got few more questions to ask you, but if anybody in the audience has any questions that they want to send through, please, now is the time. But I just wanted to kind of just focus for a second on the suppliers, so talking to any suppliers that are on this call. So Dhavani, pre-call, you said to me, this is some really important information that I want to get out to a supplier. Just give us a little context into what you would like to say to a supplier.
I guess it's around, for any supplier, contacted an organisation, almost really know that organisation, because you will know which industries that you are, you're operating in, and where you've got experience. But does that provider, or does that organisation fit that criteria? Because it might not. If you've worked a lot in professional services, but then you come to a retail environment, they're two very different environments to try and operate your product or service. And I would also say, consider the readiness of that organisation. So if you've got a product or service, has that organisation got the foundations in place to make the most of your product and service? So will it really help them? Will how they are set up culturally and from a wellbeing maturity perspective, is it in a place where they are ready for it? And if they're not, what do they need to put in place for them to be ready for it? And I would even go as far as saying, well, actually, we can't work with you until you've got X, Y, and Z in place, because those foundations are really important for your product or service to be successful, and actually for you to then get repeat business as well. Once the contracts is coming up for a renewal is really important. So it's about actually ensuring the longevity of your success with that client. Make sure that it's sustainable. What probably an example of that would be, is there a way of directly communicating to all colleagues in that organisation so they know about your product or service? Our managers are on board. Is there a decent enough wellbeing culture where it's talked about at the top? All of those kind of basic stuff. Is some of that in place for your product or service to be a success? The engagement, what are the different routes of engagement and marketing your product and service? Things like that. I think really understand those mechanisms that you need to be successful in that organisation, and consider whether that organisation is ready.
Okay, great. Bev, a question for you. Is it important to you, or do you even consider this, if a product that you're considering hasn't been tested or hasn't worked with other people in other companies in your industry? Is it important that it's been tested in your industry before?
Not always, no. I think it very much depends on the product that we're purchasing, but no, I think if we've got if it's been tested in areas where we can see there's crossover, and actually there's some similarities, then that would be good enough for us. Okay,
great. Okay, so we've got a few questions coming through here. Toni, I'm going to come to you first on this, and please, Dhavani and Bev, just put up your hand and tell me if you want to answer it as well. The question is, are you finding it a challenge to find gender-sensitive approaches to mental health and well-being?
I think it's becoming less challenging. So I think there are more providers out there now who can do that and who are very aware of that. So we certainly have got services which which can be targeted to men and women. I think, if you then are getting into the space beyond that, then that I think is definitely trickier. One of the things that I think we find a challenge is when if we're looking at any kind of service that provides clinical support, our people, I think, now want to be able to kind of choose a therapist or a coach, and they want certain characteristics or criteria to be fulfilled. and that's not always possible. So suppliers will often say to you, I'm afraid we can't do that because we don't hold that data on our counsellors or coaches, etc. It's starting to change, but I think that's something that does need to change.
Okay, either of you have any other follow-up to that?
No, other than that, I totally agree. Actually, the data element is lacking at the moment in the market, in that they certainly, when it comes to neurodiversity, we're experiencing quite a lot of people asking to talk to somebody with experience in neurodiversity or someone who is neurodiverse themselves, and that is particularly challenging for us at the moment because the data is not there to be pulled upon.
I would say race and ethnicity is the other area.
Yes.
Of that.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that. The other point on that as well, I would say, is how to almost have a dialogue around, why is that really important, and talking back to the clinical excellence of the team and the support and the advice that the individuals will get. But I think it comes down to wanting just to be able to talk to somebody of those particular characteristics. And yeah, it's the data point that really does get in the way.
Great. Okay, thank you. Another question here. Dhavani, I'm going to stay with you for this. Do you do any employee end user testing or review of services and suppliers before you take them on, aside from the data provided by the provider themselves?
Yeah, so we might do trials. It really depends on the product or service. So if it's a completely new service or something that we don't know we want to roll out to the whole of the workforce, we will do a discrete trial to see whether it works. And what we try to do, whereas sometimes it's much easier doing it a trial in a very safe kind of area, like the office. Sometimes it's not representative of the whole population. So we would take quite a difficult area almost, because you'd almost want to say, well, if it can work there, then hopefully it can work everywhere. But there are challenges around that. Probably a couple of things that we'll think about is just, capacity, even if the trial didn't come up with what we wanted to, are we going to roll it out anyway? So, is it really a feasibility trial? The time, obviously, that it takes. Sometimes it's a good way to get some engagement and some conversation about a certain product or service. They'll start talking to other regions and things like that, and then there's an anticipation. So that's sometimes a good reason to do it. But yeah, it depends on the product and service. But for some products and services, there is a requirement to actually do a trial. But for some, it's a choice.
Okay, great. Bev, a question for you here. Somebody has asked, well, they've asked what network events, but I wonder whether you do specifically target any network events when looking for new suppliers. Do you actively go to events in order to look for suppliers?
Not very often. Sometimes. I went to an event recently, a Connect event, which was interesting, but actually it's not something I do regularly. We actually lean more on this can happen than anything else, because we feel that really aligns with our strategy when it comes to wellbeing.
Thank you. Just know I didn't ask you to say that at all. Thank you. No, that's great. And Toni, Dhavani, do you outwardly go to networking events to look for new suppliers?
I wouldn't say that I go there for the primary reason of looking for new suppliers, but often you do meet people and conversations do start. I've been to a couple of conferences recently where they did have exhibitors, and I think you have to kind of be very selective. So try not to get cornered by everyone, but sort of have a good look at who they are in advance, and maybe just pick 2 or 3 that you want to go and have a conversation with. There's also networks I'm part of. So for example, for the legal industry, where, you know, we will talk about what people are doing, and so suppliers will come up in those conversations. And, you know, as Bev said, this can happen is, you know, again, a really good way of meeting people that way.
Thank you. And Bev, coming back to you again, just based on you mentioned neurodiversity, somebody has asked, do you think there is a need for more suppliers offering training in understanding and managing neurodiversity in the workplace?
I'm not sure it's a need that we've got at Ogilvy, but that's actually because we've got a really established network of people that really understand the area, and they do a lot of our education internally for us. And actually we partner with them as well when we're looking at new suppliers, as well as we do with all of our employee networks. So we kind of use them as a sounding board. So it's not something we need, but actually I can imagine from a someone in their infancy of organising their wellbeing offer, then absolutely that is probably a need. Okay, yeah.
Dhavani, did you want to say something on that?
I would say that some organisations might need it, but again, it would be looking at maybe your existing providers and what support that they can provide around neurodiversity. I think with neurodiversity, it's almost going back to maybe where some organisations were with mental health a few years ago. It's about bringing that awareness. You know, you start from the beginning, you know, awareness of what is neurodiversity, you know, and then going into a bit more detail. But it will need to be kind of a layered approach of building that awareness and understanding across the organisation, and then maybe thinking about specific subsets of employee or manager groups where you'd want to maybe build a bit more understanding around the subject.
Yeah.
So
yeah, no, absolutely. It totally makes sense. So just to say, we've got a couple more questions that I'm going to ask. So if anybody wants to send in a last minute question now, please do. But Dhavani, again, just staying with you for a second, because you mentioned earlier really well about sort of urging suppliers to really understand about the buyer, the potential buyer, et cetera, and somebody has sent in a really good question saying, how do suppliers find out about buyer needs and readiness of your organisation to assess fit for the service? You know, a very valid question.
Yeah, it's a very valid question. I think it's a lot around, if you can get a conversation with a potential organisation, to actually ask and have a conversation around less about your product and service, but more questioning around what their needs are. So, you know, asking what is their strategy about well-being, you know, where do they want to be, what, you know, how do they want to get there, do they have a clear view? And sometimes it might also be, depending on the organisation, the size, is whether you can actually provide some consultancy support in that area around actually building a well-being plan. But I think it's about asking, and then maybe if you haven't got the opportunity to ask them because you can't get into the front door, is actually just finding out a bit more about that industry, in the industry that they're in, and what is it, you know, what is it like, you know, if it's legal professional services, if it's retail, you know, what is it like, what is the general kind of view around how wellbeing is landing and what the culture is. I think that if you can find out about the culture, it will tell you a lot, more than, you know, what you need to see whether your product or service could work.
Great. And then I think I've got a final question that I think is a brilliant question for both client and what are your top mental health and wellbeing priorities for 2024? So who wants to start? Go on, Dhavani.
Yeah, I don't mind. I guess for if I talk generally about wellbeing rather than just specifically mental health, I guess for us at Tesco, it's about how we get kind of alignment across all of our markets. So we operate in quite a few markets around what wellbeing is, and try and help all of our markets move along our kind of maturity model. on that. So that's a big priority for us. If I talk specifically about mental well-being, and I think this is a challenge not just within the UK market but other markets, it's about how do we help colleagues with kind of coping and thriving with whatever life throws at them. I think we've seen over the last kind of 3 years, you know, from the pandemic to, you know, cost of living, war, you know, all of these things have had an impact, and actually it's not going away, but we need to try and kind of equip our employees with how they can, you know, cope and thrive with whatever life throws at them. So looking at kind of mental health from that angle, so a lot around resilience and burnout, but it really is around using what's happening over the last few years as a bit of a platform to continue talking about mental health, continuing to kind of create that awareness, that culture of storytelling and, you know, leadership and role modeling. So all of that is a continued priority, I'd say.
Wonderful. Thank you very, very much, Dhavani. Bev, to come to you.
Wholeheartedly agree again, actually, with Dhavani. I think it's not about new, it's about continuing what we're already doing, and it's around making sure that actually the all of our team are getting the same service and the same support that is happening in really, really well in some areas and not so well in others, and that's around bringing line managers on the journey as well. It's around bringing senior leadership on the journey and making sure that everybody is singing from the same hymn sheet, and that we're getting everybody the same level of service that they should be getting, and going back to my point previously around making sure that actually our signposting is better, and that people can self-serve without the need to signpost specifically on every element.
Okay, great. And Toni?
Yeah, I mean, we have kind of a set of minimum standards that we are trying to apply across all of our different locations. So the priorities will vary by location, by office, depending on how sort of mature they are in their wellbeing strategy and approach. So we have been spending a lot of time working with each office just to identify what those, maybe even just 1 or 2 key priorities are for FY24. So that's kind of the first thing that we're doing. Second thing is around reporting and data. So we now have a big focus on accountability, and trying to sort of measure the impact of what we're doing. So we now have a number of measures in place, including a sort of an overall firm-wide goal. So what we want to try and do is sort of trickle that down again into our local offices, so that they've all got KPIs. And then just one other thing that we're looking at is around the wellbeing, mental health of leaders. So obviously during the pandemic, in particular, I think there was a huge amount of pressure on, you know, people in leadership positions to, you know, keep the business going, support their teams, etc. And I think often, you know, even though a lot of what we offer is for everyone, I think sometimes senior leaders assume that that's not for them. So we're putting together sort of a specific program for that population.
Great. Well, thank you very much indeed to both the audience and our great speakers today. I think it's been a really, really interesting discussion that I think hopefully will be useful for both businesses and supplier businesses. Thank you so much, Bev, Toni, Dhavani, for your time today. Really appreciate it. And thanks so much, everyone in the audience, for contributing, giving such great questions. Really thank you very much for joining us today. The recording will be available for you, and we'll send it in due course. But thank you very much for joining us, and have a good rest of your day. Bye.